Moving to Sydney and planning to buy your first property. Whether you have already nailed down the property you want to purchase or you're still starting out, this video is a perfect starting point to know about everything that you need to worry about or take into consideration when looking for your first property. Having bought my second property very recently, I know how the market works right now. So this video would have all the great tips that you would need while purchasing a property in one of the most competitive real estate market in the world, that's in Sydney. But this would also apply to finding a property across Australia because the basic things remain the same, although the property prices may vary. So stick to the end to get some great tips for your journey. Sydney is a sprawling city, but well connected by public transport as well as roads. So whenever you're looking for a location that you need to buy a property in, make sure that it is well connected by public transport, as in you have a bus stop or a train station nearby, or make sure that if you have to travel to your workplace via car, then it should be close enough to your workplace. The major suburbs in Sydney are Parramatta CBD and the Sydney CBD. Parramatta CBD is towards the west and Sydney CBD is the main CBD in the center of the city. So depending on your work location, you have an option to either take the train, the metro, or the bus. The location that I currently live in is well connected to the city via metro as well as the train station. So this is the kind of locations that you should look for because such locations are high in demand, although they have a high competition, but at the same time, they do have a potential of appreciation in future. Considering the median price of houses in the city are expected to hit 2 million soon, it's always beneficial to look for a suburb that is expected to appreciate with this median price in mind. Before you even start looking for a place, I would recommend that you should look for a good mortgage broker. A good mortgage broker can limit or expand your borrowing capacity depending on the skills that the person has. Now, I'm not talking about shady ways of increasing your potential borrowing capacity. I'm talking about looking at all the options available and with your salary and your expenses in mind. They might be able to give you a ballpark figure as to what the different banks in Australia are willing to lend to you, and then use that sum in order to figure out which suburbs and what kind of property you can actually afford. I would recommend to always keep your mortgage at less than 1/3 of your monthly household income because that would help you to ensure that it is serviceable. Often people exceed this threshold and might struggle in future in order to pay off their mortgage, which could be a big problem and an unnecessary stress. Also, I would recommend you not to exhaust your borrowing capacity. For example, if you can borrow $1 million, make sure that you restrict to about 750 to 800,000 because that way you still have about a $200,000 extra amount that you can potentially use in future if you want to take the equity out and reinvest. Once you have figured out what your borrowing capacity is and you have chosen your suburb of interest, go to websites like domain.com.au or realestate.com.au and try to figure out at what price range are the different properties similar to one that you're planning to buy selling for. If you go to the sold filter, it'll give you the list of all the properties that have been sold in past few months or few years, and it can give you an approximate amount that you should target for. This would also help you when you're looking for a property and someone quotes you too high, because then you would have a reference to show them and tell them that no, this is what the prices of the property are in the area, so can you match that? A good thing is when you apply for a loan, your bank usually does a valuation. If the valuation is somewhat similar to what you have been quoted, then maybe you're safe. But then again, you have to remember that the bank only provides about 80 to 90% of your property value. So they are still having a 10% buffer. So for example, if they are saying that your property is 1 million worth, then they would actually be only paying you about 800,000. So that they still have a $200,000 buffer. So the valuation might be a bit higher than what the actual value is, but that's a risk that you need to figure out whether it's worth taking or not. When I bought my first property in Sydney, I had no idea that you could haggle and bargain a thing like a fixed property. And that is probably something that I should have considered. See, at the end of the day, when someone is selling you a property, they're still selling you a product and you are in full rights to actually try to reduce the price. So they would try to give you the best offer they can. At the end of the day, there is a holding cost involved in a property that is empty, or if it's an individual seller, if they have planned to sell the property out, they would most probably want to dispose it off as soon as possible. So taking these things into account, you can always try to haggle and bargain a little bit and ensure that you can get the property at a lower price than the one quoted by the seller. While quoting your price, you have to make sure that you're well within the borrowing capacity, as I mentioned before. You have to remember that if someone quotes you a price for the house, it is exclusive of the stamp duty. That stamp duty is something that you pay to the government of the state that you're buying a property in, and it tends to be about 5 to 7% of the property price. If you keep that in mind and keep that whole amount under the borrowing capacity, you would have a much better time servicing the loan and living a stress-free life in your newly built or newly bought home. When you're out to buy a property, you could either go for a unit, a townhouse, or a house. That again, you can go for something that's off the plan, which usually tends to be cheaper, or something that's already built. The risk in getting something off the plan is you have no surety that the property would be ready by the time that the builders have mentioned. Neither do you have a surety that the property would end up looking like the display home that you saw or the plan that you saw at the initial stages. Whereas if it's a property that is already built, you know exactly what you're getting. So that's an advantage. But those tend to be slightly more expensive than an off-the-plan property. Because in an off-the-plan property, there is a holding cost. As in, you might have already given them a major sum of money while the property is still being built. So that risk also comes with an advantage of slightly lower price. Always remember, the property that you buy appreciates because of the cost of the land increases. The built property on the land would tend to depreciate because with time, things get old and there is a wear and tear. So whenever you're buying a property from perspective of investing for appreciation, make sure you get the biggest chunk of land in the best suburb that you can, depending on the borrowing capacity that you have. So bigger the land, more it would appreciate. But then if it is something that you are purchasing in order to live in, then maybe you have to consider the number of rooms and the living area in the property that you're buying. In the whole thing, there is another important aspect and the important individual that needs to be involved, and that individual is your solicitor. Solicitor is basically the person with which the contract of the selling agent is shared. And they go through all the nitty-gritties of the property in terms of what's the legal status of the property. Are there any pending issues or pending loans around that property that needs to be considered? Whether the occupancy certificate provided or the title of the property is proper. And then whether you need to make any changes that needs to be done to the property before you settle, or different aspects that need to be taken care of. These are the things that the solicitor that you get would be very well versed with, and you can have a discussion with them regarding the property before you actually sign the contract. The contract of sale needs to be reviewed by the solicitor before it is actually signed, which is very, very much recommended because you don't want to end up in any kind of a legal tangle once you have actually signed the contract and made the payments. Usually the property tends to have about a week to 10 days of cooling off period. So in that duration, you can rescind the contract. But in case that cooling off period has ended, you would have to pay about 10% of the property price, even if you decide not to go ahead with it, because that's how the contracts are usually written down. You have to remember that when you're settling a property, after the contract of sale has been signed, you get about a couple of months in order to settle the property. And then even if the contract says that it needs to be settled in probably 30 days or 40 days, you can always negotiate with the seller in order to bring the date forward or push it backward, depending on whether the funds are available in your bank for settlement. On the date of settlement, the solicitor, your bank, the solicitor of the seller, and all the mortgage holders involved would come on an online application called PEXA. A settlement date is finalized there, and that's where all the funds change hand on the date of settlement. Always make sure as you approach the settlement to have some kind of a pre-settlement inspection so that any concerns that you have can be taken care of and actually written down before the settlement happens. So that way you have some kind of leverage in case there are issues with the property that you're buying. Usually there are multiple companies across Sydney which can work on getting your building inspection done properly, and make sure not to worry too much about the costs. If the cost is average building inspection cost in your area, go ahead. Don't go for an inferior building inspector to save about $50 to $100 because your expense on a house might be the biggest you would have had till date, and you don't want to risk it for saving about a $50 or $100. Make sure you document each and everything that's going on in this duration. None of it should be based on verbal confirmations. Everything should be written down so that in future, if there is any kind of conflict, you have something to base your requirements off. So you have decided that this is a property that you buy, the settlement date is nearing, or the settlement has already happened, and you're waiting for a move. Make sure to get a good, decent mover who is insured when making the move, because you don't want any of your stuff to get damaged during the move. Most of the movers have their rates fixed by the hour. Depending on the number of stuff that you have, you can approximately gauge how long it would take for your move and then just add a couple of hours to it, because our estimations are usually wrong. In case of a new property, you usually have about 3 months of time in which you can always reach back to the developer or the builder and make sure that any issues that you have in your property are taken care of. This is again usually something that's part of the contract, and it's usually only for new properties, because for existing properties, the property is usually sold as is. So these were the different aspects and different points that you need to take care of when you're buying a property in a city like Sydney or a country like Australia. I tried to cover everything that I personally experienced while buying a property in this video. If you have very specific questions depending on your circumstance, you can drop a comment below. So that way, if I know much about it, I would really, really love to help you out. Everything that I've shared in this video is something that I experienced while I bought my most recent property. And if you have any questions, consider me as a friend who can help you out, and not as someone who's giving you professional advice. This was Global Desis, where me and Vivian constantly try to bring new topics and new ideas to discuss with my fellow migrants and fellow Desis. Desis who want to migrate to the Western countries like UK, US, Australia, and Canada. We just try to give you as much information as we can from our personal experiences. So make sure that you subscribe to this channel for more such videos, which will really impact your immigrant life. Hope you like this video. Do hit the like button and subscribe to this channel to be constantly updated of the new content that we are bringing out. Hope you have a good rest of the day. Take care.